Let me first introduce our presenters, Robert McDermott and Debashish Banerji, and then we will get right to their conversation. Debashish Banerji is the Haridas Chowdhury Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures and Doshi Professor of Asian Art at CIIS. He's also chair of East-West Psychology and Asian Contemplative and Transcultural Studies. He has authored and edited several books on the culture and philosophy of India and on critical post-humanism. He has curated a number of exhibitions of Asian art and is co-founder of the Indian Post-Humanism Network. Robert McDermott is editor of The Essential Aurobindo and The New Essential Steiner, and author of Steiner and Kindred Spirits. With Debashish Banerji, he is editor of Philosophia, Wisdom Goddess Traditions. He was the recipient of Fulbright and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships. For 14 years, he was chair of the board of the Sophia Project for Mothers and Children at Risk of Homelessness. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Robert and Debashish.
Okay, good. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm speaking first, but Debashish will speak in a few minutes, and we'll go back and forth 2 or 3 times, which is sort of true of our friendship. We're always going back and forth about something, and this is the latest of our outings together. We have spoken on this topic or dialogued on this topic at the 50th anniversary, and other times as well. So to begin, our topic is integral education and in the history of the founding, especially in the founding, but also in the history of CIIS. And that word integral is in there, and that's what we'll be talking about. Debashish, do you want to say anything about the theme?
Yes, Robert. I mean, I think that's, as you said, it's, I think the title was given as Spirituality and Integral Education. And I think both of them are really interesting terms. They're not terms that are fully understood today because they've developed so many different meanings. You know, the philosophical understanding of the term problematic is not so much that it's bad, it's that there are many problems that it raises. You know, I think both those terms are, in that sense, problematic. They're interesting terms because they raise so many issues. Spirituality, on the one hand, it's about spirit. On the other hand, it has a history where it becomes the opposite of materialism, right? So you think of matter and spirit. And the integral is a term which has also developed many nuances over time. And today, people are not really aware what exactly integral means. So I think it's more like whole person to most people. So I think it's an interesting set of terms to discuss.
Good, thank you. That was helpful. So I'm going to speak about the integral in the founding and the early history. And I often say, and I really mean, and I think more and more, I'm convinced of the case, that CIIS was wonderfully founded. Really a great, got off to a great start in its founder, Haridas Chowdhury, who is a professor in Calcutta, Krishnagara College, who was the chair of the philosophy department, and a letter went from professor at Sanskrit to Sri Aurobindo to send a professor to represent Sri Aurobindo's thought. And through a series of conversations, Haridas was selected and left and came in 1950, and for the school to start in 1951. And we're not going to dwell on that school. That was not CIIS. That was the Academy, the American Academy of Asian Studies. And I think I could summarize the history of that school by saying simply, it was before the time was ready. The faculty didn't really know how to do what they needed to do. It was, I would say, fraught in a way that it was nobody's fault. It was just too hard at that time. And then they all scattered in the mid-50s, and Haridas went to the Cultural Integration Fellowship to teach on Fulton and Fourth Avenue. There he lectured and gave meditation classes to a wonderful group of spiritually aspiring people, which significantly included Michael Murphy and Dick Price, the founders of Esalen, and they became close friends of Haridas and Bina and close friends of the school that Haridas and Bina founded in 1968, just 6 months after the Summer of Love, and in pulsing San Francisco with aspirations and protests and psychedelics and music. It was an exciting time and a difficult time in some ways. So what was Dr. Chaudhry trying to do with this new graduate school? I know for a fact that both he and Bina told me that they did not continue the license or the approval that they had for the previous school, but they founded it very deliberately as I don't know if they used the word deed, but that's what they meant. It was a new start with a new spiritual impulse and I would say identity. And so, since we have already established that Haridas Chaudhry was devoted to the teaching and practice of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, we know that he was trying, because that's what you do with that yoga, he was trying to hold together thinking, the transformation of thinking, and action, and of course, being president of founding and being president of a graduate school is surely an action, and quite an exhausting action. And then the third one is affect or love. And I do think that Haridas and Bina tried to create something that they loved and that others would love, and that it would be a source of inspiration in a fast-moving time, not the late 60s, with lots of opportunities, lots to object to. Okay, so Debashish will talk about the Upanishads as an integral teaching. And I just want to continue a little bit more, though already anticipating that when we tried to understand what Haridas was talking about, and he was the president, but he was also the teacher. He was also the spiritual guide of the community. And so he, like Sri Aurobindo, was devoted to these three paths: knowledge, action, and love, but with an important addition which transformed the knowledge, action, and love. The addition was the evolution of consciousness. That is to say, the thinking now had to be understood in terms of what it is to be in the 20th century. And the vast explosion of knowledge and the division in the Western paradigm between spiritual and material, and for that matter, spiritual and intellectual. So that was a challenge facing him and the school. Similarly, the action had to be lifted or transformed or redeemed so that it was a selfless deed, influenced not now by Sri Aurobindo as much as by Gandhi, who is the expert exponent of this teaching, this karma yoga, which is true of Sri Aurobindo. But with Gandhi, it was the soul discipline. And he tried to show how everything that we would do would be free of a selfish motive, that we would do it because of the deed itself would be a spiritual or moral deed. And then love needed to be lifted because we're in a culture where love is obviously materialized and to some extent debased and with all kinds of appropriations and distortions. And so that's a very hard job to reestablish a deeper, truer meaning of love. Now, if you notice, I've already begun, Devashi started this, and I'm continuing talking about terms, because terms are not ordinary, casual parts of our lives. There are lots of books showing that if you control certain terms, you can have a very significant and perhaps very negative influence. So since the 14th century, when there was a split between the nominalists, the people who said there's only words, and the realists who said, no, there's something real between the words and the reality and the objects or the event. There's been that split in our culture, and more it is the case that people use words without any regard to their referent. So my favorite example is seeing people with shirts and hats with teams or clothing stores to which they have no relationship, but they just happen to be on their shirt. And I'm thinking, this is a good example of the separation of words in terms of tonight, we're talking about integral and spiritual. And so there's a separation in the culture between what words really mean and how they are appropriated and debased. What I'd like us to try to have in mind as we proceed is that we are trying to talk about spiritual in a way that we think has a clear focus and maybe even some kind of essence, different from, oh, just give me anything, and somebody who's nice or somebody who is not a money-grubbing person. But actually, I think we have to be more exact if we're going to build a whole graduate school with that word as an adjective. Now, the same is true of integral. For quite a long time, many people had given up the idea that integral is the transformation of mind, of thinking, feeling, and willing, and they decided that's the relationship between the physical and the mental, or it has to do with different academic disciplines. And so the original meaning in Sri Aurobindo and in Haridas was lost track of. So that's what we're here to talk about, and we hope you'll stay with us. Devashish?
Yes, Robert. Yes, indeed. I think what you said about words is so important. And I think sometimes words become nuanced, changed, and even turned into something opposite from what they were. And I think one of the things we can do about that, Robert, is to have a slew of synonyms that we use, so people understand words not merely for a certain kind of a meaning that a word has, but in a more kind of community way. The words form an ethos rather than forming just a certain single meaning. So from that point of view, I think, what Haridas Chaudhary was trying to do when he came is something quite, you talked about the San Francisco Renaissance. It's very different from what he was doing at Krishnanagar College in Calcutta. He was a follower of Sri Aurobindo. He was a yogi. He was a practicing yogi, but he wouldn't be teaching spiritual philosophy in Krishnanagar College. He'd be teaching the kind of philosophy, other schools over here teach. So it was something new for him as well. I'm sure. It's exciting to think about that, Robert. Don't you think? He started a new kind of of philosophical education over here, or what today we call spiritual education. I think one of the terms, and that's the term I'm using in the new concentration which we started, contemplative studies. So when we use spirituality, I think a more contemporary term that can be associated with it is contemplative studies and studies of scholarly practice, which is what he was really aiming for, that we just don't read it as armchair intellectuals who read books and split hairs about their meanings, but we actually internalize it for our own purposes. Did you get that feeling, Robert? And you met Haridas in the early, I mean, at least quite early times of CIIS. What was your feeling at that time?
Well, I could speak at length. I don't know if it would be on the topic. Haridas he really was an integral person because he was very scholarly. He was an excellent writer in English. He was articulate in a way that was elegant and eloquent. He had a great charm that was not at all superficial. He was very practical. And he and Bina were a great combination. This is a guru with a consort like Rama and Sita. And so the wonderful thing, thinking about him, is that really nothing was missing except a long life, because he died still in his early 60s, just a heart attack at his desk in 1975 when the Institute was only 7 years old. And then it really struggled without him. So he was an integral person. And so when he writes about, as for example, in his book, Integral Yoga, when he writes about the different yogas, he's writing out of his own experience. Absolutely. That makes it very convincing.
Yes, Robert. And that's what I meant. And he was encouraging that. And I think we still encourage that at CIIS. I think these two terms, because that's what we started with, our 7 commitments begin with integral education, and then the second one is spirituality. So I think it lives on in that sense. I'd say another term that is related to this kind of education that they started is scholar practitioner. That's term. What you just said, right? That Haridas, his words carried conviction because he practiced what he wrote about. And I think that's something that everybody should know, that we all have all the archives of Haridas Chaudhury's lectures. I mean, many people have heard Alan Watts, who was one of the co-founders of the early American Academy of Asian Studies. But Haridas Chaudhury's lectures and that conviction that you talk about, that eloquence, is so marked, and people should listen to his lectures, I think.
I couldn't agree more. I was once in charge of a project that reviewed all of the audio-visual materials for Hinduism and Buddhism. And so I watched, I think, about 12 Alan Watts videos, and positively, he was wonderfully eloquent with great facility of metaphors, and it just came out like that. And not so positively, certainly in comparison to Haridas Chaudhury, is that there was a facile quality, which I never detected in Haridas. He was really grounded and careful. So I'm sorry to say something not so nice about Alan Watts, but you know, I'm not going to bring him down. He's very popular. But I mention it partly because I think we all have the task to discern what is authentic and what is rooted in a person's actual life experience and what is just taken from one book to a page. And Haridas, he was this integral person. So do you want to say something about the Upanishads as an example of all this?
Yes, Robert. And so because Haridas, so the name that he gave both the incarnations that he sort of founded was Asian studies, but I think it changed to integral studies. But I think, as you told me earlier, it was in keeping with his understanding of integral. So it was a happy transition.
Yes.
That was more integral than just Asian studies.
Yes. By 1980, the school had a very large psychology program, not all of which was Asian. And so the board decided, interestingly, just before the WASC accrediting agency arrived, they decided that it would be more accurate and also an explicit honoring of the name of the philosophy and the yoga of Sri Aurobindo to call it integral. So it's not some unrooted say mathematical term or something about, oh, well, it has to do with putting things together. It's a very strong and clear word having to do with the three yogas and the evolution of consciousness. And also the Tantra. Maybe you want to say something about that.
Yes, Robert. So I think when he used the term integral so the term integral as Haridas Chaudhary got it comes from Sri Aurobindo. And when he used the word integral, he was translating the Sanskrit Purna, which he calls his yoga, Purna Yoga. He uses the term Purna, and then Haridas Chaudhary begins his book Integral Yoga by talking about Purna and its roots in the Upanishads. That's what we were discussing.
Do you want to spell that for our?
Yeah, we're
not familiar.
P-U-R-N-A.
Yeah.
Purna.
Yeah, okay.
And this is one of the earliest Upanishads, actually the earliest Upanishad, the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, on which I've just completed a book. So in the 5th chapter, they have this verse, and it goes like this. Many people have heard this. Purnam adah, Purnam idam, Purnat Purnam udachyate, Purnasya Purnam adaya, Purnam eva vashishyate. And Haridas doesn't give this Sanskrit, but he gives the loose translation of this in the book. And essentially what it's saying is, the exact translation is, Purnam, we could, again, many synonyms. Sri Aurobindo would use the word integral for Purnam. We could also use the word whole. So, the word integral as the whole, more like not the whole being a complex unity, a one thing of many things. So the whole is that, the whole is this. Out of the whole emerges. If you take the whole away from the whole, it is the whole that remains. And so this is like a puzzle or a kind of a meditative exercise. You have to meditate on this, and it sounds paradoxical. Or what remains if you take it away from itself, right? And from it, its entirety emerges. So this is the notion of the integral as something which is undividable.
And and inexhaustible.
And inexhaustible. So for example, the universe arises from something, a substratum underneath it, and it instantiates itself into all the many beings, creatures of the universe. The universe itself is the whole, and every creature in it is the whole. And nothing exhausts the whole from which it came. This is, the meditation behind it.
It's a little like Hegel, who speaks about the unity of unity and difference.
Right.
Which is another meditation. The unity of unity and difference. It's the unity of the one and the many, which in a certain sense, all Western philosophy, and I think Indian philosophy as well, is devoted to dealing with that mystery.
Right.
Yeah.
And see, so where does it fit in, in Haridas's use and in the use of, because as you said, CIIS was very strongly a psychological, based educational institute. But by the time Haridas died, the notion of the integral has to do with something which is whole inside us and something that nothing can really wound. When we talk about psychological healing, it's more than trying to mend things that are broken. It's trying to find something that's already whole inside us.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and then through spirituality, you find it. You can't find it by rationalizing about it. So that was one of the
passages
reasons
that you quoted. Is that in the book Integral Yoga?
Yeah, it begins by talking about this particular passage. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the other aspect of it that you mentioned, Robert, which has to do with the 3 yogas, which Sri Aurobindo writes his book called Synthesis of Yoga. And he breaks it up into these 4 books of parts. The first 3 parts are these 3 parts that you talked about, which he's getting from the Gita.
Right.
But another interesting and important thing to remember there is that the understanding of the differentiation of our psychology and of our goals, like you said, the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of works, the yoga of love, we have to give individual attention to each one of them. So each one of them has uniqueness, something which is singular. At the same time, they have a common root. And so that's the integral. I think that part is many people miss because they think about, many ways of knowing, etc. But how do we honor the diversity of these ways of knowing, but also find that which is, behind them?
The book is called Synthesis of Yoga, not the plurality of yoga.
Right.
Not the variety of yoga.
Right.
It's the synthesis of all of them together. Maybe we should move not so far away, but to the question of the relationship of integral education and spiritual education and ethics.
Yes.
So you know that one of the yogas is action. But if you study the action yoga, karma yoga, you pretty quickly discover that you can't really do karma yoga if you don't know quite a lot about what to do. You have to know something about the world, and you have to know about the situation, and you have to know about your own life and your own destiny and what you're here on the earth to do. So you need to have a relationship between the action and the knowledge. You also have to have a relationship between the action and what you are able to love, so that when you're choosing what to do, you are choosing to love what it is that you're involved with, whether it be a person or a deed or a country or a teaching. So that then leads me to suggest that when you're thinking about ethics or morality or justice, right? For example, the CIIS is now increasingly devoted to the cause of what we call DEI, right? The diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a matter of justice, among other things. So what is it? What is the morality of that commitment? And so I would like to suggest that if you follow the integral yoga, then you become aware that morality is not following rules or even principles. Each deed is a new deed coming out of the unity of knowledge and action and love, which is appropriate for the time where you are, when you are in the evolution of consciousness. So and this is confusing, but also slightly liberating. You can't tell what is moral by looking at a deed. you can only, you only could tell, if it were possible, by looking at the consciousness, the motivation, the whole integral situation of the person who is performing the deed or reacting or initiating some chain of events. So that just as religion is ideally not a matter of prescribed practices or a matter of dogmas and requirements. It is rather a turning, it's affirming a noumenal dimension. Noumenal actually means tipping of the head, the way you do when you're being reverent. You go, that, you tip your head. So ethics, it seems to me, in terms of which words we would associate the words, again, spiritual, which means that it's not divided off from the community, from other persons. It's not, it's not fragmented. It's integral to the whole situation, to one's community. In the Indian teaching of Dharma, there's a self at the center, but then there's also the family, there's the community, there's the caste, there's the relationship to the divine, there's the relationship to the cosmos. So you really can't commit a deed that you hope is moral unless you are integrated in all those concentric circles, if you can think of it that way. And so when we think about, well, what words we use, well, I think in terms of what's spiritual, some people think it has to do with God, and other people say, no, it's just not God. That's too specific and too Western. We just mean divine. And then other people say, yeah, but divine, but is it just mean the interior? Does it just mean non-material? Well, all those levels of meaning have to be sorted out when you use the term, and especially when you use the term in order to define and characterize a graduate school or a school with also undergraduate. You need to have an understanding of the truth of the word that you can build on together.
Yes, Robert, I think that's a very important, very, very important point, particularly for an institution which is a spiritual education, institution of spiritual education. And, even that, I'd like you to address that at some point. The very notion of spiritual education in our age, when with the division between the church and the state, the very notion of spiritual education is under question, that we are able to survive with a kind of freedom of, exploring what it means to be spiritual. I think that's really important. But related to that, the notion of ethics, because ethics often, when you're talking about social justice, social ethics, it often becomes just a matter of do's and don'ts, of, prescriptions. But as you were pointing out, it's really not about prescriptions. It's really about finding the root of this, spirituality and the spiritual root of oneness. I mean, if we can actually experience people as oneself or as the self, as the Upanishads say, Purna, integral, then ethics is the natural outcome of that. But if one doesn't, then one needs a police-keeping force, and one needs laws, and one needs to be, chastised for doing, because you don't have the inner connection of oneness from which ethics naturally arises. So I think spiritual ethics, when we are talking about social justice, has to fall back on that root of the experience, the spiritual experience of ethics.
Yeah, I think the New Testament is really good at this, because every time they tried to trick Jesus, he chose love and integrity over rules and laws. which made them more angry. But he got it straight in that sense. Okay, well, should we continue with the ethics, or do we want to talk about where we are institutionally and in terms of education?
Yeah, yes, Robert. I think that's really also something we have to think about the future. I mean, where are we now with regard to spirituality and the integral, and particularly the integral, and thinking about history and our work in the world towards the future. And I think Haridas Chaudhary and his predecessor in that sense, Sri Aurobindo, they really were foreseers. They were seers. They were prophets in that sense. They saw a time to come, a time which has come now and which we are facing right now. So I think what's really timely of our time in the teaching of the integral is that all the way from the beginnings of modernity, which we can take back to say 15th or 16th century, there has been a trend towards specialization. And it's all mental, it's divide and conquer. It's making a construction, right? We look at the world in a million perspectives, which grow smaller and smaller, and people do research and create this huge institutional network across the world with the sort of idea that someday all this will integrate into a single whole, but it doesn't. And today we are face to face with the consequence of that. It's so fragmented. People don't see eye to eye, and we are actually divorced from the earth. We are completely blind to the fact that we are no longer in inner contact with anything. So I think the integral from that point of view is a change of perspective from this notion of fragmentation, from an age of ultra specialization to an age of integration.
And in our beloved university, we do have some amount of synthesis in terms of a common root and some common ideals, etc. But we also suffer the modern Western separation of disciplines and goals, which is understandable. I'm not criticizing so much as I'm saying this is our situation in our society and education, which is part of the society. Specialization is prized at the expense of integration, which is not to say we shouldn't have specialization because we want to go deeper and deeper in whatever we're trying to learn and to teach, and that requires specialization. But it has to have soft edges. It has to be related to other concerns and other values and even other roots.
Right. So that's exactly where, I mean, when we have the other kinds of disciplinary, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary studies, I think CIIS, apart from its specialization, which I agree, I think the integral, again, is both the multiple and the one at the same time. Right. So the entire range of disciplinary specialization and their relations ultimately forming the viewpoint of the integral, the perspective that unites, I think is something that CIIS is equipped to promote.
I think it's equipped, and I think it also shows how difficult it is, because this is an institution devoted to ideals. Not many institutions of higher education are committed to ideals. They're committed to producing people who can get careers and ideally contribute back to the institution and the kind of a cycle. And that's really okay. It's positive. And at the same time, There aren't shared ideals except for smartness and the production that comes from smartness, which is positive and necessary. And at the same time, it seems to me that the advantage of the smartness in CIIS has a vertical dimension. That is to say, it has depth, it aims at depth, and other institutions can't agree on that, and they don't try to do that. They're doing something else. But producing knowledge coming out of depth and also aspiring to a higher level, a higher reality, so that instead of it being horizontal, which is perfectly adequate for most people and for most parts of the society, the integral is trying to say we are trying to be related positively to all the other parts, and also related integrally to the deep sources and to the higher dimensions. Now, some people don't like higher, but I think it's a word that is to some extent fallen, like transcendent. But I think it needs to be rescued, because the spiritual life doesn't just go horizontal. It goes deep and it goes high. And I think all of the great spiritual teachers evidence that double direction of horizontal and vertical. And so one test, I think, of integral and spiritual is whether it is only on one level, or whether it aspires to a deeper and a higher dimension. And I know, Devashish, you sometimes talk about transhuman. Do you want to say something about that in this context?
Yeah, absolutely, Robert. I think actually what I'm more interested in is what's called post-human. So they make the distinction between transhuman and post-human. Transhuman or transhumanism is more about how technology is enhancing us and making us go beyond the human. But post-humanism is actually a critique of transhumanism, because in a sense, it's the entire history of modernity, of science and technology that has brought us to the brink of some kind of an extinction. We are really, in a sense, faced with a climate crisis, unprecedented climate crisis across the world. We have pandemics that we are in the middle of right now. And then we have cultural wars going on all over the world. We are possibly in a third world war right now. So what we see is this kind of brink of a certain disaster that we brought on us, a dystopia rather than an utopia that we've brought on ourselves. So post-humanism from that point of view, I think, and related to the integral, is when we think of ourselves as a whole person, not as a human being that is limited in our scope, not as somebody who has a name, and a certain family background and a certain, kind of distinct identity, but somebody who's in deep relation with larger universal forces. So that the human is the idea of the whole person, which is another synonym for integral. And I think, you were talking about the San Francisco Renaissance. That's when ideas like the whole person really, now we talk about whole person psychology. A whole person psychology is not only the psychology of the individual whole, but it's the knowledge of the individual as the whole. In other words, the individual psychology, the human, is not the cogito of the Western rational ego, but the human is, in a sense, one with the earth, one with, say where we talk about the geosphere, the world of climate, for example. We talk about the biosphere, the world of the ecology of animals. We talk about the psychosphere, which is the cultural relations we have with other humans. I think in a way, each one of us contains all of that in ourselves. And to experience our oneness at those levels is, in that sense, a post-human integralism. And that's what interests me about this.
Yeah. And so, Debashish, let me put you on the spot. If everyone currently in CIIS as students, faculty, board members, donors, staff people, administrators were post-human in the sense in which you're speaking, that is to say, after and in some sense transcending and more than the human as it's created in the modern West, what kind of change would that bring about?
Well, Robert, I mean, you mentioned it yourself, that that's the root of spiritual ethics. I mean, they would be able to experience much more closely the feelings of the earth, the feelings of other creatures or other human beings. How can we make it our preoccupation to focus our understanding so as to feel deep unity? Or it comes from deep relationality. How can we have intimate relations with the things that we've completely separated from ourselves? And we find then that there is a deeper unity among all these things. I think that's the basis of spiritual ethics. And I think when you're talking about CIIS as making that possible, I think, as you said, to the extent that we do that, we don't need to worry so much about, policing people from the outside.
It gives me a chance to introduce the beautiful term of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher, interbeing. So he wants us to experience the between everything in such a way that nothing is cut out or isolated, and then we can see ourselves as Buddhist, Christian, Muslims, Vietnamese, American, German, Brazilians, which is the way he actually lived and thought, that there was no away and no apart and no opposed. It was like a great symphony in his thinking.
Yes, Robert. I think that's such a great example. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh is a tremendous example for the kind of scholar practitioner that CIIS should aim to produce. I think because for a number of reasons. For one, as a Buddhist, he reinterpreted the Buddhist, all the Buddhist teachings in extremely contemporary ways and ways that matter for us today. Exactly like you said, the word interbeing was his translation, just like the word integral is Sri Aurobindo's translation of the ancient Purna, which is so timely for us today.
Right.
Thich Nhat Hanh's word interbeing is a translation for sunyata.
Yeah.
Sunyata, which people normally translate as the void. And immediately you think, well, it's, outside of the world, we have to get out of the world. He says, sunyata is interbeing. In other words, it's not you, it's not me, it's what's between us. And what's between us is the whole world. It's the distances of the vast. So I think from that point of view, it's exactly what you said about Thich Nhat Hanh's.
And just by the way, it reminds me, as you were speaking, Debashish, that the Episcopal Bishop of California, Mark Andrus, who just finished a degree in PCC, wrote a dissertation and now a book on the relationship between Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King.
Right.
So here we have a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist and a Black Baptist preacher, activist, both devoted to peace in these completely different cultures. In fact, one of the cultures dropped millions of tons of bombs on the other one, and they just came together as friends because they didn't allow their national context to prevent them from interbeing with each other.
Right.
It's very beautiful.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is, Robert.
So is this the time that we should take questions? What does it say?
I think she's saying we could go on for 10 more minutes is what she's saying. But it's we are fine taking questions at this point.
Yeah, I can see this is a very promising audience. Got all the people on Zoom as well. So yes, why don't we? And I'm going to see if I can do this.
Can you go more into the transfusion and what you
I can't understand.
Yeah, I think she's asking about the question of the transhuman and the post-human, Robert.
Okay,
She's asking
Go
about
ahead.
the transhuman.
you do
So
that.
transhuman, the notion of the transhuman has arisen in our times, particularly because we are changing ourselves through medical technologies. Our limitations, we're talking about various kinds of, ultimately androids. We have chips inside us. Our prosthetics are becoming more and more sophisticated, so that ultimately how much of us remains as the natural being that we were born as. Yeah, so that's blurring the boundary between the human and the non-human, the human and the machine. So that opens up this whole area of transhumanism. And the question is, can we design bodies for ourselves which are more enduring than what God has given us, if you use that term? And so the utopians in the notion of, in the area of transhumanism, think about that. And they think about a future where because the question, the whole thing about transhumanism, it's all in the body, right? If you can tinker with your body and make it more perfect, you can create a more enduring body. But what about your thoughts and feelings? What about your memories? So they're talking about uploading memories into machines, into silicon, right? If that could be done, right? That is also gone about in a kind of a mechanical, in a fragmented way. So there's the famous transhumanist Ray Kurzweil. He's creating a tremendous archive of his father's, various trinkets and photos and all the various information that could be gathered about him. And this information can be uploaded so that the memory of that computer has a very rich kind of actual multimedia information source on which it could base its machine memory. But even if you think about it, it's not the same as human memory. So the whole idea is that with post-humanism, the idea is that, there's a number of directions to post-humanism, but what I'm interested in is that we can change ourselves by consciousness, that we can be adequate to our times. We can grow one with the earth through yoga, for that matter.
Devashish, I was right. I want you to know that. We already have 5 questions.
Okay.
So, and the first one is from Alpika. What is the relationship between Western rationalism and integral yoga? That's aimed right at you, Devashish.
Okay, what is the relationship? Yeah, between Western rationalism and integral yoga. So we were discussing that to some extent, Robert. And Western rationalism is really the kind of faculty that gives us our times, gives us our age. The modern age is a rationalist age. It's spawned by what's called the Enlightenment of the 17th century, which is really a more systematic way of approaching human lives How can we design a perfect world for ourselves? And in a way, we are in the thick of that. But the rationalist approach is always a fragmented approach. We try to actually look at various sides, analyze them, and put them together into a construct. But we miss out the whole. See, so that's where do we approach the whole? It can't be approached with the mind. But the mind, this is not a throwing out the mind. It's including the mind, but putting it in its place. Are there other forms of knowledge by which we can sense and experience wholeness? Can we experience wholeness with our imagination, for example? We can go closer. Our imagination can take us closer to wholeness. Can we experience it with our hearts? So the notion is there a deep psychic organ of unity? And that would take us to another kind of knowledge than rationality could. That would be one of the founding principles of integral yoga.
Okay, Devashish, here's a question for both of us from the audience. What are some of your favorite authors?
Robert.
I'll start.
Yeah.
I have a problem with my favorite authors because although I'm deeply committed to feminist thinking and particularly to Sophia, my three favorite authors are men. And they are Rudolf Steiner, Sri Aurobindo, and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. But a fourth would be two women who wrote The Myth of the Goddess, Evolution of an Image, which is, if I wouldn't say if they're my favorite authors so much as it's easily one of my most definitely favorite books. So that is then it sort of completes in a way that I'm okay with. Yeah, Devashish?
Yeah, mine are similar to yours, Robert. I mean, we have similar tempers of thought,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So I'd say Sri Aurobindo. Prior to him, I'd say Vivekananda, coming from an Indian tradition. And then I'd say among contemporary thinkers, Gilles Deleuze, French writer. And then Rosie Braidotti, who's a contemporary post-humanist scholar.
Wow, I don't even know that name.
Yeah, she's at the University of Utrecht. We are in contact.
Okay, see, we learn from each other. That's a great question. And for you, Devashish, what is samskara? Is it spiritually regressive? Does it stop one from achieving spiritual insights?
Is it samskara or samsara, Robert?
Samskara, okay.
Samskara,
Yeah.
right. So this term samskara is quite a complex term. Samskara, you can break it up into sam and skara. So kara is to do. And sam, because of the Indo-European roots of Sanskrit, means what it means in English, which is sum, to add together. So samskara is to bring together one's actions. And usually what it is the normal use of it is habits, things that we keep repeating. Samskaras could be some things that we internalize due to habitual action, or they could be, so they develop a momentum. Every time you repeat something, it becomes more automatic. And because the Eastern traditions believe in reincarnation, even Buddhism that doesn't believe in a self, believes in reincarnation, these habits continue into new lives. They become even stronger. So from that point of view, samskaras are automatisms of behavior that are very difficult to get over. So that's where with meditation, etc., with visualization, one can contact these habitual complexes and dissolve them. The whole idea is to dissolve them.
I'm glad you took that one, Devashish. So here's a question from Sarah. How can Ken Wilber's integral theory be incorporated into an integral education, in our view? Some members of the faculty have had a lot of knowledge and a relationship with Ken Wilber. You may know a book called Dialogues with Ken Wilber, which is edited by Donald Rothberg, who is at Saybrook, and Sean Kelly in the PCC program here in CIIS. I have an essay there. Of course, Sean does, Donald does. Houston Smith has one. Anyway, one of the reasons that it would not be difficult to integrate his thinking is because he comes from the same sources as CIIS, I mean, generally, from part of Hegel, part of Sri Aurobindo, and then he adds to that a vast amount of psychological and philosophical knowledge. He's tremendously erudite. Some people find his writing and his thinking to lack affect or a spiritual dimension. You can hear that complaint sometimes. And at the present time, he had ill health for a lot of struggles. And I know some people who are friends who are not expecting important work from him at this time. But the important positive part of Ken Wilber's work, I think, is the quatrain, the four parts, the inner and the outer, and the social and the individual. I don't think I did that correctly because I haven't looked at it in some time, but it is a useful quatrain that we could work with, and we probably do in some ways without knowing it. So it's a complicated topic. There are people who are very passionately positive, and some people who are very, very negative. And it's a bit of a polarizing name. And I don't know that I can do much more at this time without sort of getting more specific and detailed. So maybe I won't do that.
So Robert, maybe I'll say a word about.
Go ahead.
So I hold a slightly different view on that.
Go ahead.
And I think Ken Wilber's notion of integral, though he pays lip service to Sri Aurobindo, is very different from that of Sri Aurobindo. I think the difference is really that he is building a systems theory. So this notion of systems theory arose, prominently about the 80s or so. The systems theories it's again another academic approach which looks at various dimensions of specialization, but feels that they can be added up to create a single system. That it's partly everything is an organism. Everything you can talk about the human organism in terms of different systems that relate to each other, function together. So he has the notion of the whole on. So you look at a certain part, and then you find that it fits into a larger part. And that fits in, that's his integral. It's more a systems theory. I think where it differs from what people like Sri Aurobindo and Haridas Chaudhuri are saying is that every part is the whole. We go back to the Purna, that we have to find in the part the whole that is actually speaking in the entire organism. It isn't that a part makes up a whole. A part is not only part of a whole. A part is the whole. I think it's a profound difference that actually is the difference between the hierarchic and the rhizomatic. See, the rhizome has complete potency. I can become anything I want. I can know myself as anything else, but I choose to manifest in a certain way. From I'm a part, a cog in a machine, and I just need to know my part. I think that's the difference as I understand it. And I don't see it as the kind of integral that CIIS is.
Interesting. Okay, okay. I'm glad we have both of us up here. Okay, please come. Debashish, you're the technology person. I have a blank screen here. Why is it
Yeah.
blank?
Someone can help us. Or someone
okay,
can read
okay.
Oh, here you go.
Okay, at least I have color now. Debashish, do you want to do this? Oh, I have it. 6. Thank you very much. Do you know any other transformative integral educational institutions beyond CIIS? And if so, can you share them? We are often compared with Pacifica Graduate School, very Jungian in that sense. It has depth. And it has the same, approximately the same longevity. And there, Saybrook had a lot of what we have. I'm not certain that it has quite as much now as it did. I shouldn't say. Haven't looked into that lately. I don't think there's anything on the East Coast that is similar.
Right,
Actually,
Robert.
no,
There
East
used to
Coast
be
better than-
integral and transpersonal psychology that became Sophia.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think they had a similar.
they did have, but they
Particularly, they were called, no, not integral and transpersonal psychology is ITP department here.
yeah.
What were they called, Robert? They were called
ITP,
Institute of Transpersonal
but they
Psychology.
lost it completely when they
Yeah,
became Sophia. It's
That's right.
very hard to sustain what we're trying to do.
Yeah,
We're always, sorry,
yeah, Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado.
that's right. That's a good choice.
Yeah.
To some extent, you could say that CIIS came out of an Indian dimension and Naropa came out of a Buddhist dimension.
Right.
And we have faced similar challenges. I think CIS made a jump thanks to funding from Lawrence Rockefeller, to be honest.
And thanks to you, Robert,
Well, you know,
who
I
made
was
it
not the
possible.
source. I was the recipient. But that made possible
Considerable.
a quality jump that not many schools get. And, okay, so please don't go blank on me. Okay, now be nice. I'm sure there's a better way to do this, Debashish.
You're becoming.
I have it on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I can count to 6. That's, you're a witness. A question from Kimberly Maxwell. You mentioned love in the beginning of the talk with respect to how our views of it have distorted from the perspective of integral yoga. Can you talk more about that and the relationship of love to unity consciousness? Love is in the transpersonal sense, beyond the personal, with respect to a holistic, integral approach to life. Okay, that's a good last question, Debashish.
It's for you, Robert.
Oh,
You mentioned.
It's for me until I finish, and then it's for you.
All right.
So, you know, it really, I'm tempted to, I was tempted to say it comes down to love, but really I want to say it goes up to love. There's really, it's all about love and approximations and distortions. Love is the ultimate reality, the ultimate task, the meaning. It is the only reality that survives. I mean, it is what we should be doing all the time in every way possible. There isn't anything else to compete with it. There are some lookalikes, but really it's about our life is more or less about love. And if it's more, then it's good. And if it's less, it's not so good. And it's that simple and that complex because it's hard to do love and it's hard to even know when you're doing love. But I think that's the task. Debashish.
There's like
I can't understand through the mask.
She's talking about an art for love, or an art of love. There is an art of
There
love.
is an art of love. There's an art of everything. Yes, there's an art of love. And it, I mean, you can almost say if it's love, it's artful. Yeah, I don't know that there's ugly love.
Yeah, I think that there's an aesthetic quality to it as well.
Yes.
Yes, it's the root of
Thank you.
creative
Yeah.
life,
Yeah,
creative living. I agree with you, Robert. I think, spirituality and love, it's very important to understand that love in all its dimensions, love in its dimensions as relationality between people, between intimate partners, between large universals. Every form of love is ultimately a kind of a attempt to experience the one in multiple forms.
right.
So in that sense, it's a synonym for integral.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also it's the opposite of fragment.
Exactly.
And that's the end of our discussion. We thank you for coming, and we thank yes.